Hey folks, tonight we begin in a most curious place. Not a battlefield or a banquet hall, but somewhere far more squishy. Imagine the muffled squelch of a slipper in a dark stone corridor, a flickering torch, a servant glancing nervously over their shoulder, and beneath their heel, something unspeakably soft. You heard right. Tonight we're easing into the strange and sometimes stinky underworld of medieval domestic life. And we'll start, quite literally, at the bottom. The bizarre tale of servants hiding feces inside shoes. Not as a joke, not as an accident, but as a purposeful, spiteful ritual. As always, post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know who's dozing off in Dublin or settling in Snow Paulo. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world was filled with mysteries, some noble, some knightly, and some just downright nasty. Among the strangest recorded customs of revenge among lower servants was something called the stepping curse. This wasn't a formal term used in court records. It's more of a whispered practice found in diaries, servant folklore, and curious old letters. Here's how it worked. Imagine you're a chambermaid. You serve Lady Ethelberta, who today hurled a silver goblet at your head because her gooseberry tart was slightly overbrowned. You can't yell back. You can't even frown too hard. But you can sneak into her closet while she's off to mass, lift one of her fine leather shoes, and tuck something foul into the toe. Human waste, tucked neatly inside a silk stocking or a ball of straw, slipped right into the shoe's pointed tip. It was vile, it was secretive, and it was deeply symbolic. The idea wasn't just to soil a lady's foot. It was to soil her energy. The belief was that stepping into filth cursed your intentions, muddied your relationships, or brought petty chaos to your day. It was, in essence, a peasant's hex, and they believed it worked. The first written hints of this practice come from a French manor, inventory dated 1324. A disgruntled page had been dismissed, and his fellow staff members accused him of troubling the shoes of 3 noblewomen. The result? All 3 reportedly became ill with headaches and nausea, and one had visions of worms while sleeping. Coincidence? Maybe, but word spread fast among servants. In England, a 15th century manual for house staff, sort of like a medieval HR guide, warns of the planting of unclean matter in garments or footwear, a deed most base and punishable by stocks. So clearly, it happened enough to warrant a stern warning. But why shoes? Shoes, in many medieval cultures, were considered spiritually sensitive. After all, they touched the ground, the sacred dirt of God's earth, but also the filth of the devil's doing. Walking in them meant absorbing the path's energy. Slip something rotten into a shoe, and you are corrupting the body at its base. And let's be honest, medieval shoes weren't exactly Yeezys. Many were soft-soled, made of untreated leather or cloth, and absorbed odor like a sponge. A tiny gift hidden in the toe could go unnoticed until it was. Well, too late. There's one famous legend from the Low Countries about a servant girl named Enk who was beaten for spilling candle wax on a lord's scroll. That night, she crept into the lady's chamber and left a curse pellet in her fur-lined boots. The next morning, the lady wore them to church and fainted halfway through the sermon. The priest reportedly declared it a corruption of humors from below. And while we can't exactly confirm this with modern science, medieval minds thought in terms of balance. Hot and cold, wet and dry, clean and foul. To soil the foot was to offset the whole system. Now, here's a slightly lighter touch. Sometimes it wasn't real poop. Sometimes it was mashed animal organs, or even just mud and animal hair, shaped like a turd. The important part wasn't just the act, it was the intent. A medieval prank with spiritual teeth. One servant's letter from 1411, written in beautifully sarcastic Latin, describes her co-worker as so fragrant of mischief, he would gift you with perfume beneath the heel. That's either a compliment or a code for shoe sabotage. And if you're wondering, did anyone ever do this to the king? Not that we know of. Royal servants were selected for loyalty and heavily watched. But among minor nobles, especially those with large, hard-to-monitor households, these stinky rebellions were more likely than you'd think. Sometimes, revenge was poetic. One noblewoman, having berated her scullery maid for stinking of the stables, found her own silk slippers mysteriously aromatic the next morning. According to the manor steward, she wept at the offense and burned the shoes in her courtyard. There's something almost Shakespearean about it, isn't there? A dirty little drama played out not with swords or poison, but with human excrement and velvet footwear. And while the act itself was crude, it served a very real social function. It allowed powerless people, those who couldn't speak out, strike back, or escape to feel some small control over their world, even if just for one slimy step. So the next time you slip on your sneakers, be grateful. Grateful for socks. Grateful for plumbing. And grateful, above all, that no one in your life is mad enough to trouble your soles. Because back then, walking a mile in someone else's shoes could be a real crapshoot. The medieval world wasn't just dirty, it was strategically dirty. And in that grime, there was profit. It might sound absurd now, but waste human, animal, and otherwise played a shockingly central role in urban economies across Europe. What most people today flush away without a second thought was, back then, a vital commodity. Let's start with a scene. Picture a narrow, cobbled street in 14th century London. The sun is just rising over a smoky skyline. A cart trundles by, pulled by a weary mule and driven by an even wearier man. But this isn't a delivery of bread or cloth. The cart is stacked with barrels, some leaking ominously. Their contents? Human waste, freshly collected from chamber pots, cesspits, and public latrines. This man was known as a gong farmer. His job? To dig out, scoop up, and cart away the accumulated waste of the city. It was dangerous, smelly, and deeply unpopular, but it paid surprisingly well. In fact, in certain parts of England and France, a seasoned gong farmer earned more than a blacksmith. Why? Because excrement was useful. First and foremost, it was a crucial ingredient in agriculture. Cities were ringed with fields that needed fertilizing, and while cow or pig manure worked fine, human waste, referred to delicately as night soil, was prized for its strength. Mixed with straw or ash and aged in piles, it became a potent booster for grain crops. Farmers often contracted with cities to buy this sludge by the barrel. Of course, there was a downside. Disease spread easily when night soil wasn't properly treated. But in an age without germ theory, the economic need often trumped the health risk. People figured if it smelled strong, it must be strong. But the filth economy didn't stop at farming. In the world of cloth-making, urine, yes, urine was big business. Fullers, who cleaned and softened woolen cloth, used stale urine to remove grease and natural oils from raw fleece. It was called lant, and its ammonia content made it a surprisingly effective degreaser. In busy towns like York or Bruges, buckets labeled for the fuller were placed outside homes for people to pee in. Payment sometimes came in the form of clean rags or extra thread. One unfortunate side effect: walking through the tanner's district often felt like wading through a urinal. The air was thick, acrid, eye-watering. But again, the stink meant success. Let's not forget tanning, where both animal dung and urine were used to soften hides. The best leatherwork often came from workshops that smelled the worst. Apprentices were known to faint, not from overwork, but from fumes. And then there were more curious uses. In Venice and parts of Spain, human waste was used in saltpeter production, an essential ingredient in gunpowder. How did that work? Well, let's just say the chemistry involved piles of urine-soaked straw slowly fermenting under controlled heat. The resulting crystals could be scraped off and processed. War, it seems, was powered in part by pee. One of my favorite examples comes from Paris in the 1300s. There was a tax levied on homes that didn't contribute to the city's waste collection program. If your house didn't have a chamber pot or bucket available to the gong farmer, you could be fined. Imagine that getting in trouble, not for leaving waste in the streets, but for not producing enough of it for public use. Now here's a fun image. In some towns, poop farmers advertised their collection services with colorful wagons or funny rhymes shouted through the streets. One English collector was recorded as shouting, "From palace to pot, your leavings I've got." Think of it as medieval marketing, or very niche poetry. Still, this wasn't an entirely joke-filled job. Gong farmers often worked by night, partly to avoid daytime complaints and partly to hide their shame. They faced social stigma. Some cities banned them from marrying outside their profession. Others weren't allowed to live within the city walls. Yet everyone relied on them. One man's waste was another's wage. And the economy of filth wasn't just physical, it was bureaucratic. Towns had committees regulating cesspits, inspecting privies, and assigning waste collection routes. In 15th century Florence, city records show detailed maps of poop collection schedules. It's not what you'd expect from Renaissance Italy, but there it is. Even more intriguing is how the waste trade intersected with class. Rich households, with their own private privies and servants to clean them, could sell their waste exclusively to favored farmers or foolers. There are recorded cases of noble households bidding wars over who would receive their organic output. Imagine selling your family's waste like some boutique vintage wine. That exclusivity came with unexpected side effects. In one German town, a noblewoman reportedly accused her neighbor of stealing her dung, claiming it had been removed from her property without permission. The court agreed. Feces theft, an actual legal issue. So next time you hear someone say, "Money doesn't stink," remember, in the medieval world, it absolutely did. What's perhaps most fascinating is how normal it all was. No one blinked at the thought of using waste as a tool, a resource, a product. It was a different relationship with the body, with nature, and with limits. When you don't throw things away, everything becomes part of the cycle, even the unspeakable. In today's world, we've scrubbed that cycle away. We flush it, package it, hide it behind closed doors. But back then, it was right there on the street, in your field, or sloshing down the alley behind your house. The filth economy was smelly, unsanitary, and kind of genius. Let's climb a few creaky steps now out of the alleyways and into the palace. You might assume the highest role in a medieval court was some shimmering duke or war-hardened general, but no. One of the most powerful people to stand beside a king was the man who wiped his royal behind. Yes, really. They called him the Groom of the Stool, and while the title may sound like a joke now, it was once one of the most envied positions in England. This wasn't just some unfortunate servant with a cloth. No, this man was handpicked, trusted, and granted extraordinary access to the most private moments of a monarch's life. And in an age when secrets were currency, that access was everything. To understand how this position came to be, let's picture Henry VIII stout, paranoid, and surrounded by dozens of advisors he barely trusted. But the man who helped him do his business? That man, oddly enough, was someone he often trusted the most. The Groom of the Stool was responsible not only for managing the royal toilet, called the close stool, but also for recording the king's digestion, preparing clean linens, and yes, assisting in post-defecation hygiene. The stool itself was an upholstered wooden box with a padded seat, a chamber pot nestled within, and sometimes even a discreet curtain for privacy. But privacy was relative. The groom stood by, towel in hand, every time nature called. This may sound grotesque, But for the right man, it was a career maker. Because think about it, the king was at his most vulnerable when sitting on the throne's other throne. During that time, he spoke freely. He relaxed. He grumbled about political rivals. And there, in the hush of that smelly little room, secrets slipped out. And the groom? He listened, carefully. Take Sir Anthony Denny, who served Henry VIII late in life. Not only did he become one of the most trusted men in court, but he also helped manage the king's will. That's right, the man who managed Henry's bowels also helped manage the succession of the English crown. And while not every groom reached those heights, many left their roles far wealthier than they began. One theory suggests the position began humbly, as a necessity. Monarchs wore elaborate, heavy robes that made relieving oneself a multi-step operation. Removing layers, adjusting posture, holding fabrics aside, it was more like unwrapping a royal cabbage than using a restroom. And for the ill or aging king, help was simply required. But over time, that necessity turned into privilege. The groom was usually a nobleman, not a peasant. He might be the son of a lord, carefully trained in etiquette and chosen for his discretion. Discretion, by the way, was everything. A loose-lipped groom could find himself dismissed or worse. What's wild is how dignified this role became. Some accounts even mention velvet gloves and perfumed cloths. In certain households, the groom carried a small silver bowl, hand-warmed water, and scented wipes made from rose petals and vinegar. That's some luxury bathroom service. Now here's a funny detail. In the Tudor period, the groom also kept records. Actual journals noting the king's bowel movements. Tuesday, His Majesty passed well. These weren't jokes, they were medical data, used to gauge health, predict moods, or justify why the king was unusually cranky during council meetings. Because in medieval and Renaissance thinking, digestion was directly tied to temperament. If the king hadn't been in a day or two, everyone on staff braced themselves for stormy tempers. In one letter, an advisor actually blames a failed negotiation on our sovereign's sluggish belly. Let that sink in. The groom also controlled access, literally. Want to speak to the king in private? The only door without guards was the one to the royal privy. And guess who stood beside it? The groom. Over time, this turned into an unofficial channel of influence. Ambassadors sometimes gifted the groom instead of the king, hoping he'd whisper in the monarch's ear at the right moment, perhaps while the king's pants were down. Historians sometimes call this toilet diplomacy. The idea wasn't unique to England. Other European courts had similar roles, though they didn't always elevate them to the same level of respect. In France, the valet de chambre might perform similar duties, but with less political weight. And in the Papal States, even the Pope had someone quietly tending to such earthly matters, though the records are more discreet. In Japan, some imperial households had female attendants perform similar roles, although framed through a lens of sacred purification. The point is, across time and cultures, bodily functions never stopped, and someone always had to help. Now, let's pause and appreciate the weird dignity in all this. In a world of swords, poisonings, and betrayals, trust was rare, and to wipe the king, that required ultimate trust. You were in stabbing distance after all. By the 18th century, the role faded. Plumbing improved, kings became more private, and the groom was quietly absorbed into more general household roles. But the echoes remain. Modern royal households still maintain personal valets, often with access nearly as intimate, though we hope with less literal cleanup. And in a strange way, the whole idea reflects a deep medieval truth. Even kings had to go. Thrones may glitter and robes may dazzle, but at the end of the day, everyone squats the same way. So the next time you're stuck cleaning the bathroom or emptying the trash, remember, in another life, you could have done it for a king and probably gotten a knighthood. Let's move now from the royal throne to the humble chamber pot. A simple tool, a ceramic bowl, a daily necessity that, in the medieval home, held far more importance and more drama than you might imagine. Picture a great hall after a lavish feast. Candles sputter low, minstrels are packing up their lutes, and lords and ladies are wobbling to their chambers with heavy bellies and even heavier goblets of wine in their systems. Upstairs, behind embroidered curtains and thick wooden doors, the night's real ballet begins. The quiet, smelly, sometimes hilarious dance of the chamber pot. You see, in castles and manors, not everyone had a personal latrine. While some noble homes had primitive indoor privies, many bedrooms came stocked with chamber pots. Ceramic bowls are metal basins used for relieving oneself during the night. And when morning came, it was the servant's job to empty them. Imagine carrying a wobbling, sloshing pot of urine and waste down 2 flights of narrow, spiraled stairs in the dark, trying not to spill a single drop on your shoes or on your master's prized Turkish rug. It was a daily hazard, and it required balance, grace, and a stomach of iron. Thus was born the unofficial art of the chamber pot ballet, a phrase not used in the period, of course, but one that fits. In the early morning hours, servants performed a kind of choreographed shuffle across the castle, arms extended, pots balanced, doors opened with elbows, and faces turned politely away from the stench. Now, the pots themselves came in many styles. The wealthy had glazed ceramic vessels painted with floral patterns or tiny saints meant to bring divine mercy. One recorded chamber pot from 15th century England even bore the words, "Think not of fowl, but of flower." A nice thought, though not particularly helpful when emptying it. Some chamber pots were made of pewter, and others of carved wood lined with wax or pitch. And yes, for the particularly pampered, there were chamber pots with velvet covers and embroidered lids. Nothing says luxury like a poop bucket with lace. But chamber pots weren't just used in bedrooms. In castles, it wasn't uncommon for guests to use them in the dining hall. Not out in the open, of course, but concealed in curtained alcoves or behind privacy screens. One particularly memorable Italian banquet record from the 1400s notes that 3 noblemen did soil themselves with wine and required pots mid-supper. It sounds shocking, but again, context helps. Long feasts could stretch for hours. The wine flowed freely. Corsets were tight. The bathrooms were far away. And so, a quick visit behind a drape with the assistance of a silent servant wasn't all that unusual. Sometimes, though, things didn't go so smoothly. One famously embarrassing event took place in Burgundy during a winter feast. A young noblewoman, tipsy and laughing, mistook a decorative flower basin for a chamber pot. She relieved herself quite publicly, only to discover it was the table's centerpiece. The servant who tried to stop her was fired, not for failing to intervene, but for laughing too loudly. Chamber pots were also political. Consider this. In the households of high nobles, the order in which one's pot was emptied could signify rank. If your pot was taken first, you were favored. Last, you might want to reconsider your standing with the host. Some letters between courtiers include petty complaints like, "Today, Lady Edith's slop was seen to before mine. She hath risen above her station." Even chamber pot placement had rules. In some homes, the pot had to be positioned on the left side of the bed. Unless the room faced east, then it went to the right. No one is entirely sure why, but superstition and habit are powerful things. The worst chamber pot duty? That would be the guest pot. Guests didn't always empty their own. That honor fell to a special servant called the night attendant, who would tiptoe from room to room before dawn, gently knock, retrieve the pot, and whisk it away to the waste trench or cesspit. One 13th century diary describes a young servant, barely awake, tripping over a chamber pot lid and spilling its contents down the grand stairs. The lady of the house slipped in it later that morning and insisted he be whipped, not for the spill, but for failing to warn the stairs of danger. Now, let's talk quantity. In a large castle, dozens of chamber pots could be in use at once, and not all of them made it to the waste trench in time. When cesspits overflowed or weren't cleared properly, the entire courtyard could take on let's call it an earthy ambience. Summer was worst. The sun cooked everything to a rich, nauseating perfume. One visitor to the French court wrote that the perfume of roses was chased from the chamber by the knight's offerings. That's a poetic way of saying someone forgot to empty the pot. Despite the smell and risk, some chamber pots were treasured heirlooms. Families passed them down, especially if they had initials carved or came from a respected monastery. A blessed chamber pot? No, that's spiritual multitasking. Of course, there were jokes too. Medieval jesters loved chamber pot humor. Puns about leaving one's mark or offering a royal opinion were standard fare. One particularly cheeky rhyme from the period reads, "What pours like wine and steams like stew, but no one thanks the cook who brewed?" Answer, the contents of your lord's pot. It's also worth noting that many lower-class homes didn't even have chamber pots. They used buckets or simply leaned out the window, which, as we'll see later, caused some real problems for passersby. But in noble homes, the chamber pot was unavoidable. It was a part of life, part of etiquette, and occasionally part of scandal. So next time you wake up at 2 a.m. and groan on your way to the bathroom, be grateful. Grateful for flushing toilets, electric lights, and the absence of sloshing pots in the dark. Because back then, bedtime wasn't over until the last pot was emptied, and the last toe slipped on a missed drop. There's an old saying that money doesn't stink, but in the medieval world, a whiff of something foul could actually reek of wealth. Let's wander through the bustling square of a Renaissance city, where merchants haggle over silks, butchers display hams, and floats of fragrant herbs drift through the air, until you catch that powerful, heady tang of rot. Paradoxically, that rancid bouquet could signal power, prestige, or simply membership in the highest social circles. To begin, consider the simplest aroma of all, the aristocratic body. Nobles bathed infrequently, sometimes only once or twice a year, believing that hot water opened the pores to disease. Instead, they perfumed themselves with pomanders, little metal cages filled with aromatic spices like cloves, cinnamon, and frankincense, dangling from ribbons at their waists. These fragrant orbs might hang beside a jeweled girdle or curl around a ruffled collar. The more exotic or more overpowering the scent, the more you signaled your ability to import rare materials from faraway lands. But here's where it gets deliciously strange. As perfumed as nobles attempted to be, they still perspired, and their lavish fabrics turned that sweat into a potent brew. Silk bodices and velvet doublets trapped heat. Under heavy coats, servants tended to drip sweat like dripping candles. That musk mingled with spilled wine, spilled food, and every other stench. The result? A unique signature scent for each court or household. Visiting dignitaries would remember an estate by its aroma long after seeing its tapestries. And while modern noses recoil at such a combination, medieval noses were more forgiving, or rather, more accustomed. They associated intense scents with high worth. If you could afford enough spices to mask or accentuate your natural musk, you were someone to notice. Poor peasants, by contrast, bathed more often, but lacked spices to define their scent, so they smelled of earth and sweat alone. Without that layered smell of cloves, beeswax, and musk, one was visibly and olfactorily lower in status. Perfume wasn't just personal either. Aristocratic homes boasted incense burners called thuribles, which swung like chandeliers above dinner tables. A rich lord might burn frankincense, myrrh, or even more unusual resins imported from the East. The thicker the smoke, the more you flaunted your connections. In some places, A banquet's highlight was the grand release of perfumed smoke, which would drift through carved windows like violet clouds. However, not all odors admired by the elite were pleasing. Some wealthy households proudly displayed fish tanks or kept aquariums of sturgeon, eels, and carp. Fish were a symbol of both fasting and opulence fasting, because meatless days were sacred. Opulence because live fish were difficult to keep and costly to transport. The tanks seeped minerals and fish oils, emitting a sharp brine. Visitors interpreted that sharpness as a mark of abundance. They have such grand fish that their hulls smell of the sea, notes one traveler. Then there were the medicinal smells. Vials of vinegar mixed with herbs laid out on sideboards to be sniffed when a body felt unwell. Called possets, these hot curdled milk drinks smelled of sour cream, citrus peels, and nutmeg, a slightly sour perfume meant to balance the humors. A well-stocked posset display signaled education, wealth, and discretion. Housewives invited guests to refresh their spirits by inhaling the vapors A, polite euphemism for covering over that other smell. Wealthy nobles even invested in sweat basilicas, small enclosed chambers heated with hot stones and scented with lavender or rose petals. Unlike public bathhouses, often crowded and dingy, these were private rooms in manor houses. Patrons would perspire under scented steam, emerging smelling faintly of petals despite hours of heat. It was the medieval ancestor of a spa, with humidity, warmth, and perfume layered like a luxurious cake. But if you had the coin to spend, nothing trumped snake oil, literal oil, distilled from snakes, believed to carry an exotic potency. Snake oil was mixed with musk, ambergris, and sometimes egglewood. The concoction smelled sharp, musky, and or so nobles claimed imbued strength and virility. Whether it worked was beside the point. Merely possessing the bottle was enough to turn heads. Let's pause on ambergris. This rare substance, produced in whale intestines and washed ashore as waxy lumps, was prized beyond measure. A pinch of ambergris might fetch more than a good horse. Mixed with rose water, it created a fragrance so captivating that nobles kept small jars on their writing desks. Courtiers would sneak sniff tests during audiences. To smell ambergris was to breathe the sea's secret and to share in aristocratic mystery. Yet even with all these elaborate scents, the aristocratic nose could crave some raw honesty. During grand hunts, nobles followed packs of hounds through thorny woods, emerging dusty, sweaty, and smelling faintly of wet fur. That primal scent was celebrated, as it proved one had joined the chase, felt adrenaline and mud, and still had the strength to return. A lord's return from hunt met with cheers carried on the wind, and that high-born musk lingered long in great halls. Meanwhile, merchants capitalized on these status smells. Spice merchants formed guilds. Tanners and dyers offered courses on manipulating natural odors with herbs, bark, and roots. One prominent Venetian dyer specialized in dye baths infused with saffron, turning wool not just yellow, but redolent of its spice. Buyers paid extra for cloth, smelling faintly of saffron, believing the aroma confirmed authenticity. Even the Catholic Church joined the fragrance arms race. In major cathedrals, choirs wafted incense during services. The smoke served liturgical purpose, but also dazzled congregants with its exotic aroma. Pilgrims believed that the lingering smell of frankincense could carry blessing back to their villages. Monasteries sold small sachets of blessed incense to travelers' profitable wares, packed in thin leather pouches. It wasn't just about smelling good. It was about displaying the network behind the smell. Each note cinnamon, clove, musk, resin spoke of distant ports, risky voyages, and complex trade routes. To wear a certain scent was to advertise your reach. Yet, amid these grand odors, there was a playful edge. Nobles amused themselves by creating scent riddles, where guests smelled a mixture and tried to identify each ingredient. Failure might result in a small forfeit. A maid might demand a dance. a guest might supply a joke. These scent games turned foul and sweet fragrances into party entertainment. Of course, these displays of scent privilege sometimes backfired. If the perfumed air grew too thick, guests might cough, eyes might water, and someone would inevitably comment, perhaps too loudly, about the stink of vanity. One duke's extravagant scent ball in 1478 reportedly ended when half the attendees fled the hall, overcome by layers of musk and rose water. But for a few golden hours, that potent perfume was status. It was wealth you could smell, power you could inhale, and a reminder that in a world without deodorant or plumbing, fragrance was the ultimate luxury. So remember, behind every pungent bouquet stood a network of traders, a clutch of spices, and a cascade of ambition. In medieval society, one's aroma was as much a statement as one's armor or jewels, and sometimes it was downright intoxicating. The medieval world was rife with subtle sabotage, but few pranks carried as much bite as turning your enemy's latrine into a weapon. Imagine you're a disgruntled servant or a spurned neighbor. Your target isn't just their reputation, it's their daily comfort. And in a time when sanitation systems were as reliable as a tanner's mood after lunch, a crafty toilet trap could ruin an entire household's morning. You might start with a kindly-looking gift, a pail of fresh straw offered with a smile and a curt bow. The recipient thinks, "How thoughtful of my neighbor to mulch my cesspit." But beneath the straw, you've hidden razor-sharp shards of broken pottery, or worse, rusty nails. One misplaced shovel load later, the unsuspecting latrine emptier finds their hand or foot nick and bleed. Suddenly, what seemed a harmless chore becomes a bleeding nightmare. Or consider the clever mud jam. In cities like Toulouse or Pisa, where alleyways funneled waist-down communal drains, a small wedge of clay smeared at the mouth of your rival's privy drain could cause an epic clog. Overnight, the cesspit backs up. The stench soars, flies cloud the windows, and come dawn, the family stumbles into a sweltering, buzzing chamber of horrors. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was social poison. No visiting noble wants to stay in a house that smells like a brewing witch's cauldron. In one particularly dramatic case recorded in a German village in 1397, a pair of brothers took sabotage to biblical extremes. After years of squabbling over land, they agreed to a truce sealed with a grand feast. But under the long table, they had prepared a surprise: small pouches of crushed lenteja beans, known to ferment violently in waste pits. By midnight, the feasting hall stank so badly that guests retched and fled. Fences were recommissioned, and the brothers went back to squabbling, only now with an audience of stunned villagers recalling the Great Purge of '97. And while these pranks sound brutal, they were carried out with surprising etiquette. You didn't want to get caught on gossip boards, after all. Instead, you'd leave a discreet note alongside the hazard. A simple drawing of a cross, meaning beware. Or maybe a cryptic rhyme like, "When straw and shard and water meet, your morning chores become a feat." That gave your target a chance to clear the trap, though cunning folks often preferred the dramatic reveal. Yet sabotage wasn't always a servant's domain. Nobles played the game, too. During a bitter inheritance dispute in 1472, a dowager duchess ordered her rival's latrine door removed at night, replacing it with a flimsy-draped curtain. The next morning, the duke's private bathroom became an open-air theater. Courtiers whispered that the duchess exposed his dignity and more, and the duke spent weeks fuming over both his pride and his modesty. Sometimes, the most feared tactic was the drain water switch. If you could bribe or blackmail the latrine cleaner, remember those poor chamber pot ballet dancers from Section 4? You might divert your rival's waste into their neighbor's cesspit, creating a cross-contamination scandal. In one French manor, two sisters-in-law fell into such enmity that pots were switched nightly until both families ended up sharing the same trench. The ensuing outbreak of dysentery was blamed on a curse, and local priests were called to exorcise the pits. Let's not forget the ancient art of latrine graffiti, a more genteel form of sabotage with lower bodily risk. While crude insults carved into wooden seats are fairly well known, clever saboteurs took it further, carving false directions into the door. Privy this way gives, leading visitors into pitch-dark corners or into thick brambles outside the castle walls. One traveler in Bohemia, distracted by his bladder, followed such a sign and tumbled headfirst into a manure heap meant for fertilizing royal gardens. He emerged not only soaked in muck, but also convinced he'd angered a malevolent garden spirit. Of course, not all sabotage was aimed at individuals. Entire villages sometimes turned their collective ire toward an oppressive, lured by poisoning or seasoning the communal latrine. A well-placed herb known to induce diarrhea could force the nobleman to remain holed up indoors, feverish and weak, while villagers enjoyed a brief reprieve from his patrols. The trick was to place the herb in a night soil bucket before collection, counting on the Gong farmers to deliver the tainted supply. It was guerrilla warfare with digestive consequences. Yet for all this creativity, medieval people understood limits. Poisoning an entire town's water supply was considered a heinous crime punishable by death. But turning a single household's loo into a stink bomb? That was social sport. Raucous, risky, but rarely fatal. The line between practical joke and blood feud was as thin as a chamber pot's rim. Over time, some regions developed anti-sabotage rituals. In parts of Germany, a priest might bless the latrine door once a month with holy water, reciting incantations to ward off spiteful magic. In England, some households kept a tiny nail above the privy door thought to pin down malicious charms. Whether these superstitions worked is up for debate, but at least they offered psychological comfort, especially when you remembered the sting of that clay clog from the night before. And if you're chuckling at these tales, remember the medieval sense of humor was darker than ours. Pranks about bodily functions were perfectly acceptable in jest, provided you didn't cross certain lines. Messing with someone's daily hygiene? That was invitation enough for payback, often in double doses. Even kings occasionally got a taste. One record tells of a teenaged prince who, bored with court life, had the royal latrine's seat replaced with a thin brass disc. As the royal bottom made contact, the disc whined like a bow on a violin string, echoing down the corridors. Laughter erupted among the pages, only silenced when the king's own chamberlain bellowed for the prankster's head, though fortunately only figuratively. By the late Middle Ages, as stone privies and running water began to appear in wealthier homes, sabotage shifted with the times. Rich households discovered that dripping hot oil into a waste pipe could scald an unsuspecting intruder. Others rigged wooden doors with hidden pins that jabbed anyone seated too long. The goal remained the same: to unsettle and assert power, nudging the world back into balance on your own terms. These tactics remind us that medieval people, though lacking modern plumbing, had a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect. They knew how small acts, a bit of clay here, a note there, could ripple outward, disrupting comfort, dignity, and social standing. So next time you grumble about a clogged toilet or an unexpected draft around the bathroom window, think of those medieval pranksters, hiding shards of pottery under straw, staging secret clay ambushes, and turning the humble latrine into a stage for revenge. Because in a world where every chamber pot mattered, a well-executed sabotage could leave a family scrambling, a servant cursing, and a legend, however foul, echoing through the stone halls for generations. Beneath the layers of linen and wool that draped medieval bodies lay garments you'd never want anyone to see. The humble bras and drawers that collected sweat, blood, and every bit of filth a human could shed. These undergarments, rarely washed, often patched, became small biohazard zones, brimming with lice, lore, and secret messages stitched into their hems. Imagine slipping into a crisp pair of clean pants today and then realizing those same trousers were last washed sometime before Columbus landed in Cuba. In medieval Europe, washing underwear was more chore than choice. Hot water stirred the fears of miasma, soap was costly, and heavy fabrics took forever to dry. So many noble households and peasant cottages alike treated their drawers like nightly gambesons. Wear one day, rotate 3, and let them air out by the hearth. Why the hesitation? They believed that water loosened protective spirits woven into cloth. A lady's kirtle, for example, might hold charms against heartbreak or retain fertility blessings. To dunk it in a tub risked washing away both grime and the garment's spiritual armor. So instead, underwear went unwashed, earning reputations as protective talismans and potent stink bombs. Over time, these garments became repositories of personal secrets. In one well-known anecdote, a jilted lover stole his betrothed's linen drawers, stitched his name into the cuff, and left them as a calling card on her chamber door. The woman, horrified, summoned the steward who, amused, kept the pants in the manor's curiosity cabinet as proof of her ex's passion. And poor hygiene. Cloth itself could carry meaning. Homespun linen signaled modest virtue. Imported hemp or silk hinted at hidden wealth. A stitched-on patch of bright wool might mark a lady's covert politics, a subtle emblem of her chosen faction in a dynastic quarrel. And sometimes, pockets, then a novel feature sewn into the waistband, held tiny tokens. A sprig of rosemary for remembrance, or a scrap of vellum inscribed with a prayer against fever. But the real danger lingered in the dark folds. Lice thrived in the seams of bries, laying eggs in tiny stitches. It was no surprise that medieval doctors wrote treatises on pestilent drawers, prescribing fumigation with smoke from burning juniper or soaking in vinegar-laced baths. Yet few followed these remedies faithfully, likely because they reeked worse than the lice-infested cloth. When outbreaks of body vermin struck, entire households cut their drawers into strips, tied them into bundles, and burnt them on open hearths, sometimes accompanied by small exorcisms. The idea was simple: rid your body of demons by destroying their textile lodgings. New undergarments, if you could afford them, were gifts from well-meaning relatives seeking to ward off both sin and scabies. Oddly enough, some servants used their own unwashed linen as a form of passive rebellion. A scullery maid who felt underpaid might leave her, shall we say, organic drawers in her lord's private chamber, knowing the odorous fabric would cling to tapestries and bedding, an invisible mark of her protest. Manor lords often complained of mysterious stenches in rooms sealed since the last feast. A well-hidden undergarment might be the culprit. One chronicler describes a scandal in Lyon, circa 1462, when a disgraced chambermaid's stink-infused shift caused a nobleman's bride-to-be to faint on inspection. The bride's family, suspecting witchcraft, accused the maid of casting a foul glamour. It took a lengthy inquiry to prove the fault was simply exquisitely textile neglect. Of course, garments weren't always merely stinky. Some carried apotropaic inscriptions, tiny bits of text sewn into scenes to ward off evil. Phrases like "Sanct Michael ora pro me" appeared in breeches and shifts, believed to keep demons from crawling up one's legs. The same stitches that trapped filth also trapped spiritual protection. And in a world where disease and malevolence lurked around every corner, that mattered more than personal comfort. Then there's the darker side, smuggling secrets under your waist. Diplomats sometimes concealed messages in folded layers of undies, trusting that inspectors wouldn't search a noble's drawers. One letter found centuries later in a Spanish palace reveals instructions layered between unwashed cloths, still faintly scented with camphor and lavender. The surprise sniff test must have convinced the censors that nothing of value lay buried there. But perhaps the most curious tradition involved betrothal garments. A bride would sometimes keep her linen shift unwashed to the wedding night, believing that the natural odors would cement affection. The groom, inhaling his new wife's scent, would remain lovingly bound to her pheromones and to her dowry. It's not recorded whether this method outperformed elaborate dowry negotiations, but it does underscore the medieval link between smell and sentiment. Not all undead drawers were unintentional. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, peasants rubbed their undergarments with animal fats and herbs, oak bark, wormwood, and juniper to repel fleas and yeast. The greasy coating provided a barrier, and the herbal aroma pungent, slightly sweet added a layer of deodorization. While hardly spa-like, it was practical, and every bit as aromatic as the richest noble's pomander. Yet no practice was quite as memorably grotesque as the festival of the Stink King. In certain Flemish towns, during Carnival, villagers elected a mock monarch who wore stolen undergarments from the poorest homes. He'd parade through the streets, throned on an upturned chamber pot, singing bawdy songs about societal ills. The noxious odor symbolized the common people's rancor and offered a rare moment for the downtrodden to vent dominance over the elite's olfactory privileges. These bawdy celebrations remind us that beneath the stiff collars and the velvet gowns, medieval folk embraced the absurdity of their own bodies. They turned odors unwanted, though they were into jokes, rebellions, and rituals of power. Today, most of us change underwear daily and discard old pairs without a second thought. But in the medieval mind, every garment was a living record of your humors, your alliances, and your defiance. The damnable drawers might have smelled like death warmed over, but they also carried stories of protest, of politics, and of personal faith. So when you next toss a pair of socks into the laundry, spare a thought for those long-ago pants. They were at once shields against spirits, weapons of revenge, and vessels for secrets. In a world where clean linen could be more valuable than clean gold, the humble undergarment truly was the most damned of all. Step out now from the private chambers and step on to the bustling medieval street. Here, the air hangs thick with smells so fierce that they make modern city pollution seem like a spring breeze. It's a world where every passerby carries a mix of sweat, smoke, and something far less savory. The omnipresent odor of human waste, often delivered unwittingly from above. You see, in medieval towns and cities, the concept of modern sanitation was little more than a dream. Streets were lined with oaken gutters that doubled as sewers, and the upper floors of timber-framed houses often jutted out so far over the sidewalks that residents didn't even have to open their windows to empty their chamber pots. They simply leaned out and let the contents fall freely onto the unsuspecting world below. This practice was known, rather bluntly, as the gutter shower, and it was the cause of countless injuries, ruined garments, and public outrage. Imagine walking down a narrow cobblestone lane, your mind on your daily errands, when suddenly splat a warm, foul splash lands squarely on your shoulder. The victim might scream, sputter, and curse as neighbors look on, some laughing, others turning away in disgust. Officially, towns tried to regulate this. Signs appeared in busy streets warning residents not to empty their pots between the hours of 9 and 11, or other arbitrary time frames, but enforcement was lax. The wealthy could afford to keep their doors barred, but commoners bore the brunt. Vendors hawking wares had to be ever vigilant, protecting their fresh produce from unexpected showers. The situation got worse during festivals and market days. Crowds packed streets like sardines, and chamber pots emptied more frequently and unpredictably. One chronicler from 14th century Paris noted that the gutters ran red with a blend of wine, sweat, and worse, so thick the rats danced upon the surface. Rats, by the way, loved these streets as much as humans hated them. They feasted on spilled scraps and the omnipresent waste, becoming vectors for diseases like the plague. The medieval city was a breeding ground, not only for commerce, but for contagion, a fact residents understood, but could do little to change. Interestingly, some towns tried clever workarounds. In Venice, canals replaced streets, allowing waste to wash away with the tides, though the stench was no less potent. In London, piss pots placed along the Thames served as communal receptacles, though they were often overwhelmed. One city official lamented that the river is not but a floating cesspit. These problems led to the rise of the gong farmer, the medieval sanitation worker, tasked with emptying cesspits and chamber pots, often under cover of darkness. Their work was hazardous and shunned. They lived on the margins of society, often in separate districts. Despite this, their labor kept cities from becoming uninhabitable swamps. And speaking of the gong farmers, the smell of the city wasn't the only olfactory assault. Markets teemed with butchers chopping carcasses, tanners curing hides in vats of urine and lime, bakers puffing flour clouds, and blacksmiths heating iron. Add in smoke from hearth fires and candle tallow, and the medieval street smelled like a kaleidoscope of chaos. Sharp, sour, smoky, and deeply human. The stench was so powerful that in some cities, guilds organized scent brigades who would march through markets, scattering bundles of herbs, lavender, rosemary, and mint to mask the worst odors. A sort of medieval air freshener, if you will. But success was fleeting, as the raw smells always crept back like uninvited guests. And yet, despite the smells, life thrived. The odor was simply part of the background hum of medieval urban existence. People adjusted their clothes, adapted their routes, and shared a communal tolerance for the inevitable messiness of life. Now, this constant exposure bred folklore too. Tales spread of the stink spirits, mischievous entities believed to dwell in the foulest alleys, blamed for sudden illnesses or lost keys. Apothecaries sold stink ward potions, bitter brews to drink or sprinkle at doorways, meant to keep these invisible fiends at bay. Children, of course, turned the smell into games. In one recorded festival, boys raced to see who could endure the longest time, standing next to the city's largest cesspit, a feat of endurance that earned bragging rights and dubious admiration. The practice of emptying chamber pots from above also shaped medieval architecture. Some houses featured narrow wooden ledges outside windows, called guardrail boxes, that helped funnel waste away from foot traffic. A small mercy in a brutal world. Others incorporated stone gargoyles, not just for decoration, but as waste spouts directing refuse into street gutters or moats. But the problem wasn't confined to cities. In rural villages, waste was often dumped just outside doorsteps, creating muddy, fly-infested zones where animals mingled freely with humans. These were breeding grounds for disease and discomfort. Families adapted by raising chickens and pigs that scavenged the waste, recycling what they could, but it was hardly a solution. One historian amusingly notes that a common insult was to accuse someone of wearing the street's stink upon them, a claim often leveled at itinerant merchants or beggars who spent too much time near the gutters. By the late Middle Ages, growing awareness of these dangers led to incremental reforms, regulations on waste disposal, taxes on latrines, and the establishment of designated dumping areas. But progress was slow, and the legacy of medieval street smells lingered for centuries. So next time you enjoy a crisp, clean city street or a fragrant garden, remember the countless souls who lived in a world where every walk down the lane was a gamble against the sky's surprises, and every breath was a brave act of endurance. Now let's peek into a space that saw more gossip, giggles, and grimaces than perhaps any other in the medieval world, the communal bathhouse. Forget romantic visions of marble steam rooms and private tubs of rosewater. These were the buzzing, steamy, elbow-to-elbow heartbeats of medieval cities. And while they were places of cleaning, sure, they were also much more than that. Imagine stepping into one on a crisp autumn evening. The air outside is biting cold, but through the bathhouse door pours a rush of damp, pine-scented warmth. Inside, light flickers off sweating walls, and everywhere is the sound of splashing, chatter, and buckets being refilled. Naked bodies, young, old, plump, scarred move about in thick, fragrant steam. Bathhouses weren't shy about nudity. Modesty, as we know it today, took a backseat to social utility and practical warmth. In these houses of hot water and hotter rumors, class distinctions melted as quickly as the ice outside. You might find a merchant's wife and a knight's mistress scrubbing shoulders in the same basin, trading recipes or trading barbs. A mayor might sit beside his tailor, both soaking their sore legs and swapping civic news. The bathhouse was part hygiene hub, part social salon, and part medieval mixer. Men and women often bathed together, especially in Germany, Bohemia, and parts of France. They wore bathing shifts or thin linen tunics that clung to the skin and left little to the imagination. But for the most part, people weren't scandalized until the church got involved. Reforms and sermons from the pulpit railed against the fleshly temptations of mixed bathing. Some towns began to restrict co-ed sessions to certain hours, while others hired bathhouse monitors to keep an eye out for overly joyful splashing. Still, the bathhouse thrived, and with them came the bathhouse attendants, unofficial experts in skincare, folk medicine, and backcracking. For a few extra coins, one might receive a vigorous scrub with rough wool cloth, or a scalp massage lathered with egg yolk and rosemary. Medieval shampoo, if you will. The water itself was an event. Huge cauldrons boiled over open flames, and attendants carried scalding buckets to fill the wooden tubs. The first bathers got the cleanest soak. Later guests bathed in increasingly murky broth. But the communal spirit was strong. People chatted, sang, and floated herbs like mint and sage to sweeten the steam. In some towns, musicians played quietly in corners, lending a gentle rhythm to the bathing ritual. There were, of course, drawbacks. Lice and fleas sometimes traveled from bather to bather like curious tourists. Infections could spread, and there was always the risk of slipping on soap, on spilled stew, or on one of the stray eels sometimes used in warm water fish therapy. Yes, eel baths were a brief fad in a few areas, supposedly good for circulation, mostly good for stories. Bathhouses were also excellent places for eavesdropping. Secrets shared over steam traveled quickly. A merchant might confess to inflating his grain prices. A noble woman might drop the name of a scandalous lover, and before the next firewood delivery, half the town might know the tale. And when plague threatened to arrive, oh, how quickly the bathhouses emptied. Though regular bathing was thought to be healthful by many, others feared it. Some believed that hot water opened the pores to disease. The result? In plague years, bathhouses were shuttered or restricted, their tubs turned into makeshift soup kettles or quarantine bins. But during healthier times, bathhouses returned in full steamy force. They also played roles in romance and marriage. In parts of Central Europe, it was traditional for a bride and groom to bathe together publicly before their wedding night, symbolizing the washing away of their past lives. Guests would look on clothed, thankfully offering toasts and advice. It was a moment of intimacy that somehow managed to be both deeply personal and oddly communal. In cities like Prague and Cologne, bathhouse culture was so strong that streets were named for them, Batergassi, meaning Bath Lane. Some bathhouses even had reputations, with certain ones favored for matchmaking, others for medicine, and still others whispered about with a knowing smirk. Not all bathhouse activity was pure, of course. In some, lines blurred between bathing and brothels. Municipal records show repeated attempts to regulate immoral splashing, often by setting curfews or requiring windows be left open for observation. Interestingly, bathhouses also doubled as medical clinics. Apothecaries operated small annexes, selling ointments, oils, and charms to ward off boils and bad dreams. A heated soak might be prescribed for melancholy, while steam infused with thyme was believed to cure lung ailments. The line between spa and hospital was hazy, but no one seemed to mind. And yet, for all the noise and nudity, Bathhouses also offered moments of unexpected peace. A quiet soak by candlelight, the rhythmic drip of condensed steam from the beams, the soft murmur of someone humming a hymn while lathering their arms. In those brief interludes, a bather might feel genuinely renewed, not just in body, but in spirit. By the late Middle Ages, the bathhouse began to decline. Plumbing improved slightly. Private baths became a mark of luxury. The Renaissance brought shifts in hygiene philosophy, and eventually, the communal soak lost favor. But its legacy lingered. The bathhouse was more than a tub of warm water. It was a crucible of gossip, of social mingling, of brief equality in a deeply hierarchical world. In the bath, titles were washed away, and everyone wrinkled the same. So next time you step into a hot shower, maybe add a sprig of sage. An old tune. Pretend you're beside a merchant and a monk, a page and a poet, all steaming together in the medieval haze. And be thankful you don't have to share your tub with a wriggling eel. Now let's peek into a space that saw more gossip, giggles, and grimaces than perhaps any other in the medieval world, the communal bathhouse. Forget romantic visions of marble steam rooms and private tubs of rosewater. These were the buzzing, steamy, elbow-to-elbow heartbeats of medieval cities. And while they were places of cleaning, sure, they were also much more than that. Imagine stepping into one on a crisp autumn evening. The air outside is biting cold, but through the bathhouse door pours a rush of damp, pine-scented warmth. Inside, light flickers off sweating walls, and everywhere is the sound of splashing, chatter, and buckets being refilled. Naked bodies, young, old, plump, scarred, move about in thick, fragrant steam. Bathhouses weren't shy about nudity. Modesty, as we know it today, took a backseat to social utility and practical warmth. In these houses of hot water and hotter rumors, class distinctions melted as quickly as the ice outside. You might find a merchant's wife and a knight's mistress scrubbing shoulders in the same basin, trading recipes or trading barbs. A mayor might sit beside his tailor, both soaking their sore legs and swapping civic news. The bathhouse was part hygiene hub, part social salon, and part medieval mixer. Men and women often bathed together, especially in Germany, Bohemia, and parts of France. They wore bathing shifts or thin linen tunics that clung to the skin and left little to the imagination. But for the most part, people weren't scandalized until the church got involved. Reforms and sermons from the pulpit railed against the fleshly temptations of mixed bathing. Some towns began to restrict co-ed sessions to certain hours, while others hired bathhouse monitors to keep an eye out for overly joyful splashing. Still, the bathhouse thrived, and with them came the bathhouse attendants, unofficial experts in skincare, folk medicine, and backcracking. For a few extra coins, one might receive a vigorous scrub with rough wool cloth, or a scalp massage lathered with egg yolk and rosemary. Medieval shampoo, if you will. The water itself was an event. Huge cauldrons boiled over open flames, and attendants carried scalding buckets to fill the wooden tubs. The first bathers got the cleanest soak. Later guests bathed in increasingly murky broth. But the communal spirit was strong. People chatted, sang, and floated herbs like mint and sage to sweeten the steam. In some towns, musicians played quietly in corners, lending a gentle rhythm to the bathing ritual. There were, of course, drawbacks. Lice and fleas sometimes traveled from bather to bather like curious tourists. Infections could spread, and there was always the risk of slipping on soap, on spilled stew, or on one of the stray eels sometimes used in warm water fish therapy. Yes, eel baths were a brief fad in a few areas, supposedly good for circulation, mostly good for stories. Bathhouses were also excellent places for eavesdropping. Secrets shared over steam traveled quickly. A merchant might confess to inflating his grain prices. A noble woman might drop the name of a scandalous lover. And before the next firewood delivery, half the town might know the tale. And when plague threatened to arrive, oh, how quickly the bathhouses emptied. Though regular bathing was thought to be healthful by many, others feared it. Some believed that hot water opened the pores to disease. The result? In plague years, bathhouses were shuttered or restricted, their tubs turned into makeshift soup kettles or quarantine bins. But during healthier times, bathhouses returned in full steamy force. They also played roles in romance and marriage. In parts of Central Europe, it was traditional for a bride and groom to bathe together publicly before their wedding night, symbolizing the washing away of their past lives. Guests would look on clothed, thankfully offering toasts and advice. It was a moment of intimacy that somehow managed to be both deeply personal and oddly communal. In cities like Prague and Cologne, bathhouse culture was so strong that streets were named for them, Batergassi, meaning bath lane. Some bathhouses even had reputations, with certain ones favored for matchmaking, others for medicine, and still others whispered about with a knowing smirk. Not all bathhouse activity was pure, of course. In some, lines blurred between bathing and brothels. Municipal records show repeated attempts to regulate immoral splashing, often by setting curfews or requiring windows be left open for observation. Interestingly, bathhouses also doubled as medical clinics. Apothecaries operated small annexes, selling ointments, oils, and charms to ward off boils and bad dreams. A heated soak might be prescribed for melancholy, while steam infused with thyme was believed to cure lung ailments. The line between spa and hospital was hazy, but no one seemed to mind. And yet, for all the noise and nudity, bathhouses also offered moments of unexpected peace. A quiet soak by candlelight, the rhythmic drip of condensed steam from the beams, the soft murmur of someone humming a hymn while lathering their arms. In those brief interludes, a bather might feel genuinely renewed, not just in body, but in spirit. By the late Middle Ages, the bathhouse began to decline. Plumbing improved slightly. Private baths became a mark of luxury. The Renaissance brought shifts in hygiene philosophy, and eventually, the communal soak lost favor. But its legacy lingered. The bathhouse was more than a tub of warm water. It was a crucible of gossip, of social mingling, of brief equality in a deeply hierarchical world. In the bath, titles were washed away, and everyone wrinkled the same. So next time you step into a hot shower, maybe add a sprig of sage. An old tune. Pretend you're beside a merchant and a monk, a page and a poet, all steaming together in the medieval haze. And be thankful you don't have to share your tub with a wriggling eel. If you'd been lucky or perhaps unlucky enough to be a guest in a medieval noble household, there's a strong chance your stay would include a curious little gift upon waking. No, not breakfast in bed or fresh linens, but a neatly emptied chamber pot, whisked away with such silent grace that you might not even know it had happened. It wasn't magic. It was thanks to the invisible battalion of underservants, whose entire job revolved around managing the waste of the upper classes. Let's meet them. At the bottom rung of the domestic ladder was the groom of the stool. Despite the oddly royal-sounding name, his job was, quite literally, to manage his lord's private business. In grand estates and palaces, this role was not only accepted, but highly prestigious. The groom had unrivaled access to the monarch or noble's private moments, moments where secrets were spilled, plots were hatched, and alliances were whispered between. Less than glorious groans. This proximity to power meant that some grooms became trusted advisors. Kings might confide in no one but the man who held their chamber pot. It's said that Henry VIII's groom of the stool had so much political influence that courtiers tried to bribe him with gifts and land. After all, if you're going to entrust someone to wipe your royal rear, you'd better also trust their opinions on court appointments. But for every powerful royal groom, there were dozens of humble pot-bearers, stool scrubbers, and dung-ditchers in lesser homes. These unsung workers started their day long before sunrise, tiptoeing through cold stone corridors with sloshing pails, trying not to wake the household with a misplaced splash. Their tools were simple: wooden tongs for lifting waste-soaked linens, rags soaked in vinegar, and iron buckets reinforced with leather. Their uniforms? None. They often wore their oldest tunics, thick aprons if they could get them, and shoes stuffed with straw to block the cold and the worst of the smells. And yet, they developed techniques that were nothing short of remarkable. In one English manor, waste was collected on a rotating schedule involving bells. One bell meant chamber pots upstairs were full. 2 bells meant the guest had left a message and the staff needed to hurry. 3 bells meant, well, let's just say there had been a catastrophic overflow and reinforcements were needed. Chamber pots themselves were little works of art, glazed pottery, often brightly painted, featuring scenes of saints, sinners, or ironically orchards and flower gardens. Some bore inscriptions. One 14th century example from Burgundy had scrawled across its rim, "He who fills me shall empty me in turn." Equal parts warning and philosophy. Yet not all pots made it back to the kitchen safely. Some broke in stairwells, others tipped mid-transport. The resulting mess was a source of shame and punishment. In certain households, breaking a pot earned a week without food or a night spent sleeping near the kennels. Worse still was being blamed for a false empty, removing a pot too soon, and forcing its noble owner to hunt down a second. A scandal indeed. Cleaning wasn't just about scooping. Servants would scrub pots with ash and sand, then rinse with hot water, and finally douse them in a mix of rosemary oil and lime water if the household could afford it. Cheaper homes used boiled onion skins or stale ale. Surprisingly effective, both for killing bacteria and masking odors. Some wealthier estates even kept pot perfumes, small vials of vinegar mixed with rose petals or powdered iris root, dabbed onto the chamber pot's rim. Guests were expected to notice. If you didn't comment politely on your host's fragrant waste bucket, it was considered a minor insult. Of course, servants were human too. Stories abound of under-butlers writing rude messages on the bottoms of chamber pots, visible only when they were cleaned. "Your grace is full of it," one read, in Latin. Another featured a crude cartoon of a noble's rather recognizable nose. These pranks, while risky, were a small rebellion in a world of constant deference. For children in the household, the pot carried both mystery and mischief. Young pages dared each other to touch the chamber pots of visiting dignitaries, a game both disgusting and politically reckless. One poor lad was caught balancing a plum on a marquis's pot, only to have it discovered mid-use. The marquis found the prank amusing, the page's tutor did not. At the heart of all this was a silent economy of dignity. Servants labored not just to clean, but to erase the evidence of human frailty, to make noble life appear seamless, spotless, even when it very much wasn't. They were the original crisis managers, restoring composure before a guest arrived or a household rose from bed. In some towns, specialist guilds even emerged. Stoolmen in Florence wore green sashes and were dispatched to clean communal housing blocks. In monasteries, younger monks took vows of humility that often included toilet duty. In fact, one medieval rulebook insists that a monk's spiritual strength could be measured by how cheerfully he scrubbed a latrine. But this was thankless work. Many servants developed chronic coughs from fumes, skin ailments from constant contact with lye or urine, and joint pain from crouching for hours. They went unmentioned in household records. No bard sang ballads of the pot scrubbers. And yet, they knew everything. Who had guests? Who had indigestion? Who had snuck out during the night? In their buckets swirled the secrets of the house, and in their silence, they wielded a quiet kind of power. One tale even tells of a castle-maid who, upon being dismissed unfairly, added a bit of soot and crushed nettles to her lord's pot. He suffered days of agonizing itch and accused half the staff of witchcraft. The truth? Just a servant getting the last word. So next time you think of the great medieval halls, spare a thought for the ones who made those halls livable. The ones who padded quietly through dawn's shadow, chamber pot in hand, keeping the illusion of nobility afloat. Because in the end, even kings had to go. And someone very tired, very skilled, and likely very underpaid, had to carry the burden. Let's turn now to one of the strangest intersections of faith and filth the medieval world had to offer. Holy relics, public penance, and the unexpected role of human waste in both. Because in a time when spiritual cleanliness was seen as more vital than physical hygiene, bodily functions became tangled up in divine rituals, odd superstitions, and some frankly bizarre beliefs. It all began with an idea that sin lived in the flesh and sometimes literally in the gut. Medieval theology was rich with metaphors of purging, cleansing, and casting out. And just as a confessor could help expel your soul's wickedness through prayer, your body might cooperate by purging its contents through illness, sweat, or the more graphic methods. There are records of saints described as having miraculously pure, excrement fragrant, even glowing. In one 13th century account, a mystic nun's bowels were said to emit a sweetness like myrrh, which supposedly confirmed her saintliness. Historians today raise eyebrows, of course, but for believers. These stories were less about anatomy and more about illustrating that spiritual purity could transcend even the body's most base processes. For the rest of us, though, waste was a battleground of sin. Monasteries were especially meticulous about managing bodily functions. In some Benedictine orders, monks had assigned latrine hours and were forbidden to speak while on the privy. Silence in the latrine wasn't just practical, it was holy. Speaking while relieving oneself was thought to distract from reflection and tempt idle or impure thoughts. Imagine trying to have a peaceful moment with the Lord while Brother Geoffrey won't stop whispering about the soup. To aid with purification, monks practiced regular fasting, enemas, and herbal purges. Some monasteries had dedicated medicinal gardens that grew herbs known for their laxative qualities: senna, rhubarb root, and buckthorn bark. These weren't recreational teas, they were acts of piety. Clean bowels, clean soul. In rare cases, especially among ascetics, the body was pushed to extreme ends. Some wore hair shirts beneath their robes, itchy, lice-attracting garments that not only punished the flesh, but also captured sweat and grime in ways that invited suffering. A few even rubbed dirt or dung into their garments, believing that physical degradation brought them closer to God's humility. One poor soul, Saint Simeon Stylites, famously lived atop a pillar for decades and likely smelled like a compost heap by the end. And yet, filth could become sacred. Consider the cult of relics. These were often bits of saintly bodies, bones, teeth, even fingernails, but sometimes even the most questionable artifacts were venerated. A monastery in northern France claimed to possess a cloth used to wipe the brow of a dying hermit, which, upon later inspection, turned out to be a soiled undertunic. The monks kept it anyway, encased in silver. Pilgrims came to see it, believing the bodily stain was blessed, not profane. This wasn't mere superstition. There was theological logic here. If the saint's soul had sanctified their body, then anything their body touched, yes, anything carried traces of holiness. In that light, even a sweat-stained shift or the foul-smelling bandage of a healing wound could be divine. On the flip side, sighing was also tracked through waste. During confessions, some priests asked not only about moral failings, but about digestive irregularities. Diarrhea could be interpreted as a sign of guilt made flesh literally, your conscience working its way out. A firm and regular stool was, in a strange term, a symbol of good standing with God. Imagine showing up for confession with a chart. And penance? Oh, penance had its own messy chapters. In some cases, those guilty of serious sins like theft, adultery, or blasphemy were made to walk barefoot through muddy streets, wearing garments soaked in their own urine or dung. The humiliation was the point. A sinner should feel lower than the animals. Sometimes, public punishments involved being placed in stocks with chamber pots left nearby not to use, but as reminders of one's filth. In one particularly nasty town custom, a repeat drunkard was strapped to a cart and wheeled through town with dung smeared on his forehead and the phrase, "I am as I smell," painted across his chest. Crude? Absolutely. But the symbolism was clear. In a world where everyone wore multiple layers and scent traveled quickly, the power of odor as moral messaging was potent. Smelling foul meant something was spiritually wrong. On the other hand, cleanliness was no guarantee of holiness. Too much washing was sometimes seen as vanity. Saints were praised for refusing to bathe. Saint Agnes was said to have worn the same shift for years. Saint Catherine of Siena refused all bodily comforts, including basic hygiene, claiming she'd rather stink to heaven than tempt the senses. Interestingly, holy water had a double meaning here. Used for blessings, yes, but also believed to cleanse not just sin, but foul smells. Some households sprinkled it over chamber pots. It's a recorded fact that one 15th century Italian bishop traveled with a servant whose entire job was to pre-sprinkle the bishop's travel toilet with holy water before each use. And even pilgrimage routes weren't safe from this intersection of sanctity and stink. Pilgrims walked for days, weeks, sometimes months often, with no access to clean water or facilities. The smell became part of the devotion. It was joked that you could find your way to Santiago by nose alone. Pilgrims even carried badges shaped like chamber pots, partly in jest and partly to warn innkeepers of the odor to come. Of course, not everyone took this with grace. In some abbeys, visitor logs included side notes. Brother Thomas has arrived 3 days from York strong of faith and stronger of scent. Diplomacy in ink, if not in nostril. And beneath all this was the deep belief that to be human meant to be messy. The body was a temporary vessel, often leaking, often sinning, always needing maintenance. Waste was part of the divine experience, part of humility, part of atonement, part of the drama between flesh and spirit. So if you've ever lit a candle to cover a bathroom visit, or whispered a prayer after a questionable lunch, just know you're walking in the footsteps of saints. By now, you've probably realized that medieval life didn't shy away from the unspeakable. It simply found strange, poetic ways to live alongside it. But nowhere did this coexistence of the grotesque and the sacred get more theatrical than in the world of superstition and magical protection. Because in a world filled with disease, poverty, and unpredictable death, people clung to the idea that a well-placed charm or a properly hidden piece of excrement might ward off catastrophe. Yes, you heard that right. We begin with something quaintly called apotropaic magic, from a Greek word meaning to turn away. It was the art of protection through symbolism, amulets, rituals, talismans, and in some cases, carefully donated bodily waste. In medieval Europe, especially in rural regions, it was not uncommon to hear of people tucking human feces or urine-soaked cloth into the walls, beneath floorboards, or even inside shoes to repel evil spirits or curses. This wasn't just gross behavior, it was ritualistic. Certain types of waste were thought to have magical resonance, particularly if they came from a virgin, a pregnant woman, or a red-haired child. The idea was that these fluids carried purity or intense energy that disrupted demonic forces. And while it may sound absurd now, to the terrified families of the 1300s, it felt no stranger than praying to a saint or sprinkling holy water on a doorframe. In some corners of Europe, especially in the British Isles and Germanic regions, witch bottles became a common defensive tool. These were glass or stoneware jars filled with nails, hair, nail clippings, and sometimes urine or feces. The belief was that a witch who had cursed someone could be tricked into attacking their own energy, now trapped inside the bottle. To seal the spell, the bottle might be buried beneath a hearth or wall. A few were even boiled, releasing a nose-curdling vapor meant to boil away the evil. Excavations in old cottages and manor houses have turned up dozens of such vessels, many still sealed. Some were wrapped in cloth and tied with string and echo of a long-forgotten protection spell. And the few that have been opened, let's just say the archaeologists wore gloves and very strong expressions of regret. Shoes, too, were powerful. Hiding an old shoe behind a chimney or beneath floorboards was thought to lure evil spirits away from the people inside. Why? Because the spirit would become fixated on the scent and shape of the human foot and spend eternity trying to possess the shoe instead of its owner. Gross, yes, but clever. This brings us back to the title of our tale, the odd practice of hiding poop in shoes. While not exactly widespread, this tactic crops up in multiple folk accounts. Most often, it wasn't random, it was revenge. In England and France, spurned lovers or disgruntled servants would defecate into a noble's soft leather shoes and then carefully stuff the shoes back into the wardrobe. Imagine slipping your foot into a lovely new pair of calfskin slippers and discovering yesterday's resentment nestled inside. But in a few cases, the pooping shoe trick was used magically. The idea was that stepping into another person's essence would bind them to you, create confusion, or ward off a curse. Some believed it could trap a spirit lingering near the foot, a common place for ghostly energies to attach, apparently. There's a record from rural Germany where a farmer's wife placed sheep dung into her husband's boots to keep him from wandering. It worked. At least temporarily, he slipped, injured his ankle, and stayed home for a week. She claimed the spirits had taken her side. In broader folk magic, bodily waste wasn't only used for protection, it was also seen as a medium for control. Charms written in menstrual blood, love spells brewed with urine, or hexes that included clumps of hair and dung were all part of the grim and gooey toolkit of village sorcerers. Some spells even instructed practitioners to smear feces in the shape of a cross on a rival's door, said to bring shame, misfortune, or, at the very least, a very confused cleanup crew. Of course, not all uses were so sinister. Dung, particularly from cows and horses, was considered deeply cleansing in some spiritual traditions. In parts of medieval India and the Islamic world, animal dung was used to ritually purify surfaces or drive out negative energy. This idea trickled into parts of Europe, where dried manure was sometimes burned in exorcism rites. The smell, it was believed, drove out both spirits and faint-hearted sinners. Now, let's not forget about dream magic. Dreams were seen as messages from the divine or demonic, and their interpretation was serious business. If someone dreamed of feces, it could mean wealth. Yes, really. Excrement in a dream was often interpreted as an abundance of something, like gold or good luck. But if you dreamed of stepping in it, that could mean betrayal or scandal, especially if it was in a shoe. Some nobles even hired dream readers, who would sit by the bedside and listen to the Lord's overnight visions. If waste appeared in the dream, the reader might prescribe a ritual cleansing, a day-long fast, a cold wash in the river, or in rare cases, burning an item of clothing worn during the dream. If that item happened to be shoes, well, make sure you checked inside first. Superstition wasn't limited to peasants either. The rich were just as bound by fear. Kings carried talismans made of dried animal droppings wrapped in gold foil, meant to ward off poison or ward away witches. There's even a record of a French noblewoman who insisted on keeping a goat's bladder filled with her firstborn's meconium. Yes, baby poop hidden beneath her mattress, claiming it protected her household from the evil eye. Absurd? Maybe. But in a world where death arrived on horseback, in the water, or on the wind. Anything that smelled of life, even if it also smelled really bad, was welcome. So yes, sometimes servants did hide poop in shoes, not just to disgust, but to defend. It was messy magic. Folklore made flesh. A desperate, primal kind of alchemy, born of fear, superstition, and the stubborn will to protect one's little corner of the world. Because in the end, when you couldn't afford a sword, a doctor, or a priest, you made do with what you had, even if what you had was poop. If medieval life taught anyone anything, it was that you needed to have a strong stomach literally and metaphorically. Because whether you were a peasant in a plague-stricken village or a duchess at the banquet table, life was going to throw a lot at you, and not all of it would land politely on your plate. Let's begin at the table. Banquets in noble households were grand affairs full of roasted swans, sugared almonds, elaborate pies, and spiced wine. But just beyond the laughter and lute music, the digestive realities lurked close. Without modern understandings of food safety, guests frequently fell ill from spoiled meat, contaminated water, or unwashed hands. A dinner party could quickly become a purge party. In fact, vomiting was not only expected, it was, in some circles, encouraged. Wealthy diners might excuse themselves mid-feast to visit the vomitorium. Contrary to myth, this wasn't an architectural room in Roman colosseums. It was simply a euphemism in medieval times for the little corner or bucket where a guest could make room for dessert. Some nobles prided themselves on how much they could consume in one night, and purging during the meal was seen as a mark of refinement, not revulsion. Those attending these feasts, servants, pages, and the occasional jester, often had to clean up quietly and efficiently. One rule in the 14th century household of the Duke of Anjou specifically instructed servants to remove slops with haste and no comment. Translation: don't flinch, don't gag, and for the love of all that is holy, don't laugh. Now, contrast this with the peasant diet. Coarse bread, onions, dried beans, ale, and whatever could be foraged or traded. While these foods were more humble, they had one big advantage: they were far less likely to induce medieval food poisoning. Peasants often ate simpler, more fermented foods, which had natural preservative properties. In many ways, the lower classes had better gut health, simply because they couldn't afford fancy feasts that had sat unrefrigerated for days. But even the strongest stomachs had limits, especially when it came to medicine. Enter the world of remedies, the often stomach-turning potions and plasters meant to fix what ailed you. Got indigestion? Drink a brew of warm ale mixed with crushed snails and goose fat. Suffering from constipation? Swallow ground ant eggs steeped in vinegar. Feeling melancholy? Place a poultice made from sheep dung and butter directly on your navel. Instructions varied, but the theme remained. If it smells awful and makes you gag, it must be working. One physician famously prescribed cow dung boiled in beer to a noblewoman for her recurring headaches. She took it for 3 weeks and reported that while her headache had not vanished, at least she no longer feared death, for death would be cleaner. It wasn't just humans either. Animals were given similar treatments. Farmers swore by rubbing cow manure on a sick horse's hooves or inserting garlic cloves into a sheep's rear to prevent winter chills. These weren't just whims. They were passed down as precious knowledge. Folk wisdom from people who had very few options and desperately needed their animals to survive. In cities, matters grew even more complex. Waste from humans and animals mixed in the streets, forming a sludgy, noxious brew that soaked into shoes, skirts, and skin. It was such a problem that certain city officials, known as scavengers, were paid to patrol the streets and hurl warnings at people emptying chamber pots from windows. Still, incidents happened. One record from York in the 1420s tells of a merchant's wife who was struck squarely by a falling chamber pot while walking beneath a dormer window. She wasn't seriously hurt, But she did sue the household for an affront most cruel and wet. The court awarded her 2 chickens and a fine new bonnet. Justice, medieval style? Then there was the problem of reusing waste. That's right, waste wasn't always wasted. Dried animal dung, particularly from horses or cows, was used as fuel for fires. It was collected, stacked, and dried in carefully shaped paddies, often with handprints still visible on their surfaces. In parts of northern Europe, these were called cake fires. They burned hot, clean, and were surprisingly efficient. Human waste was also recycled often as fertilizer. Known as night soil, it was collected by the aforementioned Gong farmers, who sold it to rural landowners. Farmers prized it for its richness, especially if it came from wealthier areas. Apparently, what the upper classes lacked in fiber, they made up for in market value. But using night soil was risky. Without understanding bacteria or proper composting, it often led to contamination. Crops grown on poorly treated waste fields could cause illness or worse. Yet for many, the risk was worth the reward. A bumper crop meant survival. A bit of sickness, just the price of dinner. Of course, people talked about waste constantly, just not in the same way we do today. It was folded into superstition, humor, and even flattery. A common compliment in taverns. You eat like a knight and relieve like a prince. Strange, yes, but it meant you had both appetite and good digestion, a sign of strength. There were even jokes, scatological riddles, and wordplay. One popular medieval jest involved asking, "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, 3 in the evening, and never once uses a chamber pot?" The punchline? A liar. It made little sense, but it always got a chuckle after enough ale. And let's not forget fashion. Yes, fashion. To mask the ambient smells of daily life, nobles and merchants often tucked sachets of herbs, flowers, or spices into their sleeves and collars. These were called pomanders. One woman in Milan reportedly fainted at a banquet when her pomander dropped into her soup. Her friends thought it a poisoning until a servant pulled a floating bundle of cloves and lavender from the broth. By the late Middle Ages, people were beginning to connect hygiene with health. Public bathhouses, though controversial, were promoted as healthful. Privies were improved in monasteries and castles. Waste pits were dug deeper. Slowly, very slowly, the idea that clean is good began to take root. But for most of the era, the body and its waste were simply part of daily life. Smelly, messy, unpredictable, but also humorous, spiritual, and at times, even magical. Because when your world is uncertain and the night is long, sometimes all you can do is laugh, light a dung fire, and hope your shoes are empty when you wake. We've wandered through chambers, cesspits, and castles, peered into chamber pots, and peeked beneath floorboards. But before we drift into sleep, there's one final place to visit, perhaps the most overlooked of all, the medieval street. Because when it came to public life in medieval towns and cities, the boundaries between private and public waste were, let's say, porous. Picture this: a cobbled alley in 14th century Paris. It's early morning. The sky is the color of wet parchment. A merchant opens his shutter and yawns. A servant, half asleep, empties a bucket from the upper floor with a shouted warning. Gardez-l'eau, a phrase derived from the French, regardez l'eau, or watch out for the water, except it wasn't water. And heaven help the man who didn't heed the cry. In cities like London, Bruges, and Florence, sanitation was a slow-moving concern. Waste, both human and animal, flowed freely through the streets, mixing with straw, ash, rotting produce, and bits of cloth. The smell was pungent, complex, and ever-present. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, you had to navigate it daily. Footwear with thick soles wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a survival tactic. So why didn't they just clean it up? Well, some did. Municipal officials, known in England as muckrakers or scavengers, were employed to remove waste from the streets. But with thousands of households tossing their refuse out windows and into shared alleys, the job was never ending. They worked at night or just before dawn, scraping up the day's leavings and hauling them in wagons to city edges or riverbanks. And yes, these were the same men who sometimes resold night soil as fertilizer. Waste management medieval style. Yet for all this, the street wasn't considered dirty in the way we might think today. It was just part of life. Children played in it, vendors sold meat beside it, and public punishment took place right on it. Stocks and pillories were often set near the market, so offenders could stew in shame while others went about their shopping. One particularly grim job belonged to the gong farmers, those brave souls tasked with cleaning the cesspits of public and private latrines. They worked by moonlight, descending into pits with shovels, ropes, and covered lanterns, emerging hours later, covered head to toe in filth. Their work was vital, but their status was rock bottom. Laws often barred them from entering churches or public feasts. And yet, without them, entire neighborhoods might have drowned in their own detritus. Some towns experimented with early sewage systems. London, for instance, had a network of runnels, narrow channels built into the street to help direct wastewater. But these often clogged, overflowed, or simply became waste pits themselves. Rats thrived, so did disease. During outbreaks of plague, these very channels were hastily doused in lime or covered with rushes in the hopes of sweetening the air. Speaking of air, public toilets, where they existed, were often open-air affairs. Imagine a plank set over a ditch on the outskirts of town, or a series of shared seats in a wooden hut. Privacy was minimal. And graffiti? Oh yes. Some of the earliest examples of vulgar medieval graffiti come from public toilets etched into wood with knives, scribbled in charcoal, or scratched into stone. Here sat Thomas, one reads. He stinks still, adds another, less kind hand. The idea of privacy around bodily functions, so important to us today, was still forming. Modesty existed, of course, especially for women. But the public nature of waste, its smell, its sound, its constant visibility, meant people had different thresholds. You didn't have the luxury of pretending you didn't share the street with last night's dinner. That said, innovation was slowly creeping in. By the 15th century, wealthier homes began to install pipe privies, early forms of indoor toilets that channeled waste via sloped stone pipes to the street or a cesspit below. These were a marvel at the time, allowing for private relief within the home. But without proper water flow or sealing, they often just rerouted the smell into new corners of the house. And then, there was the matter of etiquette. Yes, even in the presence of all this chaos, medieval people cared about manners. Books of courtesy instructed noble children not to pick their noses at table, not to sniff their armpits, and most importantly, not to relieve themselves too near others. One manual advises, be sure your back is to the breeze, lest your company suffer your wind doubly. It's a small note, but it reveals a larger truth. Medieval people weren't unaware of smell or disgust. They just had fewer options. And in a world where death, disease, and spiritual danger loomed daily, they had more pressing concerns than the scent of the street. Still, laughter remained a powerful balm. Flatulence jokes were abundant in medieval literature. Chaucer's tales are full of them. Priests made them from the pulpit. Even kings weren't immune. One story tells of a jester who earned a gold coin each time he could make the queen laugh with a fart. Apparently, he died a wealthy man. And in their stories, their songs, and their whispered jokes, medieval people acknowledged what we still understand today, that the human body is both ridiculous and marvelous. That dignity and dirt often coexist. That even in a world of chamber pots and clogged streets, life could be joyful. Because ultimately, The mess was proof of life. The smells, the stains, and noises all reminders that people had gathered, eaten, worked, prayed, fought, and loved in those streets. That they had lived. And that, dear listener, brings us gently to the edge of our journey. Now let's slow our pace. The fires have burned low, the streets have emptied, and even the busiest kitchens have gone quiet. The clang of pots, the laughter at supper, the hush of footsteps through cold stone corridors faded now, like breath on a winter window. The castle walls no longer echo with movement, only memory. The chamber pots have been emptied, the shoes set neatly by the hearth, and the servants tired and quiet have folded into shadow. Even the rats in the granary have curled into corners, their hunger stilled for the night. Let yourself rest in this stillness. You've traveled through narrow alleys and noble halls, peeked behind tapestries, and stepped carefully into the world of those who lived with less comfort, but no less wonder. Breathe deeply now, in and out. Feel the weight of the wool blanket tucked around your shoulders. Imagine the distant hoot of an owl. Somewhere far off, a bell marks the hour. One long, lonely note that fades into velvet silence. There's nothing more to see tonight. No more chamber pots, no more pranks, no more cloaked grooms gliding through dawn. Just the hush of the world asleep. So rest easy, traveler. You've braved the unspeakable and smiled through it. And now, like the castles we visited, let your thoughts settle, your breath soften. The story has been told. Sweet dreams.